Good day. I'm Siti Isnihara Basher-Talib, and for my report in Educ 503, Psychology of Learning, under Ma'am Faranisa, I'm going to present to you a brief overview of the origins and fields of psychology. For the objectives, I'm going to discuss what is psychology, discuss the origins of psychology, discuss the emergence of psychology as a separate science, discuss the pioneering women in the field of psychology, and discuss both the fields or branches of psychology. But first, let us get to know the meaning of psychology. Psychology is the study of the mind, how it works, and how it affects behavior. It also studies and explains behavior of entire living organisms. It embraces all aspects of the human experience from the functions of the brain to the actions of nations, from child development to care for the aged. It encompasses the biological influences, social pressures, and environmental factors that affect how people think, act, and feel. It also includes the behavior of people from infancy to old age, the normal as well as abnormal. Psychology can be roughly divided into two major areas: the research, which seeks to increase our knowledge base, and the practice, through which our knowledge is applied to solving problems in the real world. Since you now know what psychology is, maybe that give you the idea of who is a psychologist. A psychologist is someone who studies psychology or the science of mind and behavior. It also studies human issues that begin before birth and continue until death. A person with a condition that affects their mental health may benefit from assessment and treatment with a psychologist. A psychologist may offer treatment that focuses on behavioral adaptations. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who is more likely to focus on medical management of mental health issues. The psychologists and psychiatrists work together to help people with mental health conditions, but they are not quite the same. A psychologist treats a patient through psychotherapy that helps to relieve symptoms through behavioral change, while the role of the psychiatrist, who is a medical doctor, focuses more on prescribing medication and other interventions to manage mental health conditions. A psychologist may have other roles too. They may carry out studies to advise health authorities and other bodies on social and other strategies. Also, they can assess children who find it difficult to learn in school. They can also give workshops on how to prevent bullying, and also they can work with recruitment teams and companies and so much more. Since psychology is the study of the mind, how it works, and how it affects behavior, then what is behavior? Behavior is the way in which one acts or conducts oneself, especially towards others. It is also the way in which an animal or person acts in response to a particular situation or stimulus. And it includes the cognitive and affective, the conscious, subconscious, or the unconscious, as well as implicit or explicit. So, because human behavior is so varied, the number of fields in psychology is also constantly growing and evolving. Some of these fields have been firmly established as areas of interest, and many colleges and universities offer courses and degree programs in these topics nowadays. Each field of psychology represents a specific area of study focused on a particular topic, and oftentimes a psychologist specialized in one of these areas as a career. And for many of these specialty areas, working in that specific area requires additional graduate study in that particular field. While the psychology of today reflects the discipline's rich and varied history, the origins of psychology differ significantly from contemporary conceptions of the field. And in order for us to gain a full understanding of psychology, we need to spend some time exploring its history and origins. Psychology is a relatively new discipline, but it has its roots in philosophy and biology. While psychology did not emerge as a separate discipline until the late 1800s, its earliest history or origin can be traced back to the time of the early Greeks. And by understanding the history of psychology, we can gain a better understanding of how these topics are studied and what we have learned thus far. So, from its earliest beginnings, psychology has been faced with a number of questions. The initial questions of how to define psychology establish as a establish it as a science separate from biology, physiology, and philosophy. So now, let's take a brief look at some of the ways in which philosophy and biology have influenced the development of psychology, and so that we will know the answer to these questions. How did psychology originate? When did it begin? And who were the people responsible for establishing psychology as a separate science? Let's start with Rene Descartes. Rene is the father of modern philosophy. This French philosopher suggested that the mind and the body are separate from each other. And this idea became known as the Cartesian dualism. Although this view has since been challenged, it influenced psychology because it suggested that the mind can be an object of study in its own right. Next is John Locke. John is an English philosopher and a physician. He is widely regarded as one of the most influential of Enlightenment thinkers and commonly known as the father of liberalism. He proposed empiricism. This is the belief that all experience is obtained through the senses. He argued that human beings do not inherit knowledge or instincts. Instead, humans are born a blank slate or tabula rasa. He influenced the principle in psychology that human behavior can only be fully understood by investigating external events that are observable and measurable. Next is Charles Darwin. Charles is an English naturalist, geologist, and a biologist. He is most famous for his theory of evolution. This states that all human and animal behavior has changed over successive generations. He believed that individuals with stronger, more adaptive genes survive and reproduce. The assumption that many human behaviors, such as aggression and mate choice, have evolved due to their adaptive value, has been hugely influential in psychology. In particular, it has influenced the biological approach to explaining human behavior. Now that you have learned a little about the early days of psychology, let's take a closer look at the emergence of psychology as a uh, scientific subject. In 1879, Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt, a German physiologist, philosopher, and a professor, known today as one of the founders of modern psychology. His book, published in 1873, The Principles of Physiological Psychology, outlined many of the major connections between the science of physiology and the study of human thought and behavior. He who distinguished psychology as a science from uh, philosophy and biology was the first person to actually call himself a psychologist. He later opened the world's first psychology lab in 1879 at the University of Leipzig. This event is generally considered the official start of psychology as a separate and distinct scientific discipline. So, how did Wundt view psychology? So, he perceived this subject as the study of human consciousness and sought to apply experimental methods to studying internal mental processes. He is the first to use the experimental methods to study the structure of the mind. He also uses a technique called introspection, seen as unreliable and unscientific today. His early work in psychology actually helped set the stage for future experimental methods. Wundt and his co-workers recorded their own conscious thoughts and broke them down into their constituent parts. And also, an estimated 17,000 students attended Wundt's psychology lectures, and hundreds more pursued degrees in psychology and studied in his psychology lab. While his influence dwindled as the field matured, his impact on psychology is unquestionable. Next is in 1800s, Edward Bradford Titchener. Edward is an English psychologist who studied under William Wundt for several years. Actually, he is one of the uh, most famous students of Wundt's. He is best known for creating his version of psychology that described the structure of the mind. It is the structuralism and also found the psychologist's first school of thought. According to the structuralists, human consciousness could be broken down into smaller parts, and using a process known as introspection, trained subjects would attempt to break down their responses and reactions to the most basic sensation and perceptions. While structuralism is notable for its emphasis on scientific research, its methods were unreliable, limiting, and subjective. So when Titchener died in 1927, structuralism essentially died with him. Also in 1800s, William James, an American philosopher, historian, and a psychologist, in this time, the psychology already flourished in America during this um, mid to late 1800s. He is also the first educator to offer a psychology course in the United States. He published his classic textbook, The Principles of Psychology, which also established him as the father of American psychology. His book soon became the standard text in psychology, and his ideas eventually served as the basis for a new school of thought known as functionalism. The focus of functionalism was about how behavior actually works to help people live in their environment, and functionalists utilize methods such as direct observation to study the human mind and behavior. So, both of these early schools of thought, the structuralism and the functionalism, emphasize human consciousness, but their conceptions of it were significantly different. While the structuralists sought to break down mental processes into the smallest parts, the functionalists believed that consciousness existed as a more continuous and changing process. So, while functionalism quickly faded, a separate school of thought, it would go on to influence later psychologists and theories of human thought and behavior. In 1900s, Sigmund Freud, an Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis, he established the psychodynamic approach. Sigmund Freud actually changed the face of psychology in a dramatic way, proposing a theory of personality and emphasized the influence of the unconscious mind of behavior. He argued that physical and psychological problems could be explained in terms of conflict within the mind. He is the first to argue that psychological illness has a psychological cause and that it should be treated psychologically. The psychoanalytic theory proposed by Sigmund Freud had a tremendous impact on the 20th century thought, influencing the mental health field as well as other areas including art, literature, and popular culture. While many of his ideas are viewed with skepticism today, his influence on psychology is undeniable. So, how does psychoanalysis influence the field of psychology? So, it is the rise of behaviorism in 1900s. The psychology changed dramatically during the early 20th century as another school of thought known as behaviorism rose to dominance. Behaviorism was a major change from previous theoretical perspectives, rejecting the emphasis on both the conscious and unconscious mind. Instead, behaviorism strove to make psychology as more scientific discipline by focusing purely on observable behavior. And behaviorism had its earliest start with the work of a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov. He is a Russian physiologist known primarily on his work in classical conditioning. His research on the digestive systems of dogs led to his discovery of the classical conditioning process, which proposed that behaviors could be learned via conditioned associations. He demonstrated that this learning process could be used to make an association between an environmental stimulus and a naturally occurring stimulus. Also in 1900s, an American psychologist named John Watson soon became one of the strongest advocates of behaviorism. He is, again, an American psychologist who popularized the scientific theory of behaviorism, establishing it as a psychological school. He advanced this change in psychological discipline through his 1913 address at Columbia University, initially outlining the basic principles of this new school of thought in his 1913 paper, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. He later went on to offer a definition in his classic book Behaviorism in 1924, writing, Behaviorism holds that the subject matter of human psychology is the behavior of the human being. Behaviorism claims that consciousness is neither a definite nor a usable concept. The behaviorist, who has been trained always as an experimentalist, holds further that belief in the existence of consciousness goes back to the ancient days of superstition and magic. The impact of behaviorism was enormous, and the school of thought continued to dominate for the next 50 years. In 1913, Boris Frederick Skinner, or popularly known as B.F. Skinner, an American psychologist, behaviorist, author, inventor, and a social philosopher, furthered the behaviorist perspective with his concept of operant conditioning, which demonstrated the effect of punishment and reinforcement on behavior. B.F. Skinner was a professor of psychology at Harvard University from 1958 until his retirement in 1974. He established the behaviorist approach. He also furthered the behaviorist perspective with his concept of operant conditioning. He argued that psychologists should use scientific methods to understand behavior, and this involves only studying observable, measurable behavior. He believed that the mind should not be studied as it cannot be objectively measured. While behaviorism eventually lost its dominant grip on psychology, the basic principles of behavioral psychology are still widely in use today. The therapeutic techniques such as behavior analysis, behavioral modification, and token economies are often utilized to help children learn new skills and overcome maladaptive behaviors, while conditioning is used in many situations ranging from parenting to education. While the first half of the 20th century was dominated by psychoanalysis and behaviorism, a new school of thought known as humanistic psychology emerged during the second half of the century, often referred to as the third force in psychology. And this theoretical perspective emphasized conscious experiences. These two, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, are two of the authors or the founders of this approach. Carl Rogers was an American psychologist, while Abraham Maslow was also an American psychologist who was best known for creating Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a theory of psychological health predicated on fulfilling innate human needs and self actualization. They are the founders of humanistic approach in psychology. The American psychologist Carl Rogers is often considered to be one of the founders of this school of thought, while the psychoanalysts look at unconscious impulses and behaviorists focused on environmental causes. Rogers believed strongly in the power of free will and self determination. Psychologist Abraham Maslow also contributed to humanistic psychology with his famous hierarchy of needs theory of human motivation. And this theory suggested that people were motivated by increasingly complex needs. And once the most basic needs are fulfilled, people then become motivated to pursue higher level needs. The humanistic approach in psychology became known as the third force in psychology. It rejected the psychodynamic approach of Sigmund Freud and its pessimistic views on humans. It also disagreed with the behaviorist view of V.F. Skinner that all behavior has a cause beyond the control of individual. Instead, it believed that all humans are essentially good with the freedom to choose one's own behavior. Their approach also disagreed with using scientific methods to study humans by B.F. Skinner. During the 1950s and 1960s, a movement known as the Cognitive Revolution began to take hold in psychology. The cognitive revolution of the 60s came about because of the introduction of the computer. During this time, the cognitive psychology began to replace psychoanalysis and behaviorism as the dominant approach to the study of psychology. Psychologists were still interested in looking at observable behaviors, but they were also concerned with what was going on inside the mind. This gave psychologists a metaphor for how the human mind processes information. The cognitive revolution reintroduced the study of mental processes to psychology, but in a much more scientific way than Wundt's earlier investigations. The cognitive approach take over from behaviorist approach of Skinner and continues to be dominant today. The introduction of brain imaging tools such as PET scans have helped improve the ability of researchers to more closely study the inner workings of the human brain at this time. In 1970s, the 1970s saw the development of social psychology, which studies how people behave in groups. Many experiments that were carried out during this time would not be allowed today due to their highly unethical nature. However, this research has contributed enormously to our understanding of behaviors such as obedience, conformity, prejudice, and discrimination. In 1980s and onwards into the 90s, the biological approach began to establish itself as the dominant scientific perspective in psychology. This is due to advances in technology that have led to an increased understanding of the brain and biological processes. In the 21st century, by the beginning of the 21st century, the cognitive neuroscience has emerged as a discipline. It brings together the cognitive and biological approaches. The cognitive neuroscience is influenced by the earlier computer models, and it investigated how biological structures influence mental states. And it is set to become the dominant area in psychology. One of the famous inventions in these fields is the magnetic resonance imaging, or the MRI. MRI is a type of scan that uses strong magnetic fields and radio waves to produce detailed images of the inside of the body. MRI scanner is a large tube that contains powerful magnets. It empowered the neuroscience with the tool to investigate the inner structure and workings of the central nervous system. It is also a painless radiology technology technique that has advantage of avoiding X-ray radiation exposure. It can also be used to detect brain tumors, traumatic brain injury, developmental anomalies, multiple sclerosis, stroke, dementia, infection, and the cause of headache. There are also no known side effects of an MRI scan. The benefits of an MRI scan relates to its precise accuracy in detecting structural abnormalities in your body. Look at this timeline. You can see then that psychology has come a long way since the early days of Wundt and his introspection laboratories. As we have seen in this brief overview of psychology's history, this discipline has seen dramatic growth and change since its official beginnings in Wundt's lab. And the story certainly does not end here. No? So, as I said earlier, psychology has continued to evolve since 1960 and new ideas and perspectives have been introduced. Recent research in psychology looks at many aspects of the human experience, from the biological influences on behavior on the impact of social and cultural factors. Today, the majority of psychologists do not identify themselves with a single school of thought. Instead, they often focus on a particular specialty area or perspective, often drawing on ideas from a range of theoretical backgrounds. This eclectic approach has contributed new ideas and theories that will continue to shape psychology for years to come. But as you read through or any history of psychology books and research, you might be particularly struck by the fact that such texts seem to center almost entirely on the theories and contributions of men. And this is not because women had no interest in the field of psychology, but is largely due to the fact that women were excluded from pursuing academic training and practice during the early years of the field. But actually, there are a number of women who made important contributions to the early history of psychology, and though their work is sometimes overlooked. So, one of the pioneering women in the field of psychology is Mary Withon Calkins. She is an American philosopher and psychologist. She rightfully earned a doctorate from Harvard, although the school refused to grant her degree because she was a woman. She conducted research on dreams and memory. Despite the obstacles she faced, she became the American Psychological Association's first woman president. Next is Anna Freud. She is a British psychoanalyst of Austrian Jewish descent. She is the youngest daughter of Sigmund Freud, and she had made important contributions to the field of psychoanalysis as well. She followed the path of her father and contributed to the field of psychoanalysis. She described many of the defense mechanisms and is known as the founder of child psychoanalysis. She also had an influence on other psychologists, including Erik Erikson. Next is Mary Dinsmore Ainsworth. Mary Dinsmore Ainsworth is an American-Canadian developmental psychologist, made important contributions to our understanding of attachment. She developed a technique for studying child and caregiver attachments known as the strange situation assessment. So, in order for us to understand how psychology became the science that it is today, it is so important to learn more about some of the historical events that have influenced its development. While some of the theories that emerged during the early years of psychology may now be viewed as simplistic, outdated, or incorrect, these influences actually shaped the direction of the field and helped us form a greater understanding of the human mind and behavior. There are different types of psychology that serve different purposes, and there is no fixed way of classifying them, but here are some common types which I will discuss to you later. It is very difficult to understand all these aspects of behavior in one sphere. So, hence, in order to make it convenient to study, understand, and access the behavior at different fields of life, psychology is divided into different branches or fields. And these branches or fields are broadly divided into two categories: the pure fields and the applied branches of psychology. The pure branches or fields provide the theoretical framework of the subject. These branches deal with formulation of principles, theories, and suggest different methods for the assessment of behavior. The pure fields also suggest certain techniques for the modification of problematic behavior. Under the pure fields of psychology are number one, general psychology. This branch deals with the fundamental rules, principles, and theories of psychology in relation to the study of behavior of normal adult human beings. It also explains various psychological processes like sensations, perceptions, emotions, learning intelligence, personality, and more. Second is physiological psychology. Physiological psychology is a branch that describes the biological basis of behavior. And there is a close relationship between the body and mind, and the functions of each other are mutually influenced. The functioning of the brain, nervous system, endocrine glands, and their relation to cognitive, and affective behavior is explained in this branch of psychology. Next is animal psychology. No, it is the developmental psychology. Developmental psychology, this branch explains the growth and development of various processes in relation to behavior. This is also the scientific study of systematic psychological changes that a person experiences over the lifespan, often referred to as human development. And it also looks at innate mental structures against learning through experience, or how a person's characteristics interact with environmental factors and how this impacts development. Next is child psychology. So, we all know that childhood extends from 2 to 12 years and is actually the crucial period in the life. So, our future life depends upon the development during childhood, and the growth and development will be rapid during this stage. And child psychology deals with these aspects. Next is animal psychology. This branch deals with behavior of animals. Many psychological experiments are conducted to know the functioning of mind and animals. Animals like rats, dogs, chimpanzees, pigeons, guinea pigs, cats are some of the animals used for experimentation. And the findings of these experiments are many times generalized to human behavior also. An animal psychologist is an expert in the behaviors and social relationships between animals within a community and to external biological entities like other species and relationships with human. Next is evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology looks at how human behavior, for example, language, has been affected by psychological adjustments during evolution. An evolutionary psychologist believes that many human psychological traits are adaptive in that they have enabled us to survive over thousands of years. Next is social psychology. So, human being is a social animal, they say. Naturally, the behavior of an individual is influenced by society and in turn influences the society. Social psychology deals with interrelationships of people among themselves, likes and dislikes of people, attitudes and interests, the prejudice and social distances people have, the group behavior, the group cohesiveness, the group complex, and more. The social psychology actually uses scientific methods to understand how social influences impact human behavior and seeks to explain how feelings, behavior, and thoughts are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of other people. And what is a social psychologist do? A social psychologist looks at group behavior, the social perception, the nonverbal behavior, conformity, aggression, uh, like what I've said, prejudice, and leadership. The social perception and social interaction are seen as key to understanding social behavior. Next is cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology investigates internal mental processes such as problem solving, memory, learning, and language. It looks at how people think, perceive, communicate, remember, and learn. And it is closely related to neuroscience, philosophy, and linguistics. A cognitive psychologist look at how people acquire, process, and store information. The practical applications include how to improve memory, increase the accuracy of decision making, or how to set up educational programs to boost learning. Next is abnormal psychology. So, today, the life is very complex. The individual is facing a lot of competition and experiencing frustration and conflicts. And constant pressures in life are leading to psychological abnormalities. Abnormal psychology deals with various kinds of mental disorders, their symptoms, and its causes. It also studies unusual patterns of behavior, emotion, and thought, which could be understood as a mental disorder. The last field is parapsychology. Parapsychology investigates paranormal or psychic phenomena, and some of the psychological experiences are beyond the reach of five sense organs. That is why they are called extrasensory perceptions or the sixth sense. Some of the phenomena studied in ESP are as follows: the clairvoyance, telepathy, psychokinesis, precognition, reincarnation, and contacting souls, which I will discuss also. A parapsychologist aim to test the existence and explore the nature of experiences and abilities in paranormal realm. Under the parapsychology is the clairvoyance. This is referred to as television, which is seeing the distant things mentally. We perceive at times some situation or things without the help of our eyes. It in total seeing things which happen beyond our visual field through mind is called clairvoyance. And it is actually a claimed ability to gain information about an object, person, location, or physical event through extrasensory perception. Next is telepathy. Telepathy is the transformation of emotions from one person to another person who is in a far place. It also refers to the supposed ability to perceive the thoughts of others without the use of recognized senses. For example, a person who is in deathbed, remembering his close relative may be experienced by the concerned person who is far away from him. Next is psychokinesis, also called as telekinesis. It is moving the objects without direct contact through power of mind. Next is precognition. It is knowing the future happenings well in advance. At times, people will gain the knowledge of future called precognition. For example, some accident or disaster that may take place after some time will be known before time. Then there is reincarnation. This is otherwise called rebirth or transmigration. There are some instances reported where people remember the previous life details. And also, Indian people, they say that the easy way to detect a reincarnated soul as similar in gestures such as body language, laugh, and physical expressions. And last is contacting souls. There are some reports that the souls of dead people are contacted through people called mediums. And these mediums use a plate called planchette or Iha board and establish contact with souls. So let us now go to the other applied branches of psychology. The applied branches deal with the application of psychological principles and techniques for approaching the problem in different fields of life. The first is educational psychology. This is the most important field where psychological principles are applied. In the field of education, learner is the focal point. Other aspects like management, teachers, teaching and learning aids are all meant for learners. The learners differ in their abilities, hence, they need different approaches in teaching, learning material, and all. This branch addresses to the problems and improvement in teaching and learning process. Next is the clinical psychology. This branch deals with the therapeutic aspect of mental disorders. The clinical psychology integrates science, theory, and practice in order to understand, predict, and relieve problems with adjustment, disability, and discomfort. Also, it can help us to understand, prevent, and alleviate psychologically caused distress and dysfunction, and also promote an individual's well-being and personal development. A clinical psychologist concentrates on the intellectual, emotional, biological, psychological, social, and behavioral aspects of human performance through a person's life across varying cultures and socio-economic levels. And there are many types of mental illness requiring varied types of therapies like chemotherapy, psychotherapy, recreational and occupational therapies, behavior therapy, and etc. The psychological assessment and psychotherapy are the essential to the practice of clinical psychology, but clinical psychologists are often also involved in research, training, forensic testimony, and other areas. Next is industrial psychology. Human beings are different from machines. They will have many problems in their work or workplace like adjustment, safety, security, health, financial, and such other problems. Both the management and workers need to cooperate in dealing with such problems. And the industrial psychology seeks application of psychological principles, theories, and techniques for the study of all these problems and the industrial environment. Next is counseling psychology. So, mental disorders may not be completely and easily cured just by drugs and other physical therapies. In addition to other therapies, these patients need counseling also. So, counseling is a process in which an interaction takes place between a trained counselor and a client. And this branch also helps people to overcome adjustment problems. Next is the forensic psychology. Forensic psychology involves applying psychology to criminal investigation and the law. A forensic psychologist practices psychology as a science within the criminal justice system and civil courts. It also involves assessing the psychological factors that um, might influence a case or behavior and presenting the findings in court. Next is health psychology. Health psychology is also called behavioral medicine or medical psychology. It observes how behavior, biology, and social context influence illness and health. A health psychologist usually work alongside other medical professionals in clinical settings. A physician often looks first at the biological causes of a disease, but a psychologist will focus on the whole person and what influences their health status. This may include their socioeconomic status, education and background, and behaviors that may have an impact on the disease, such as compliance with instructions and medication. Next is neuropsychology. Neuropsychology looks at the structure and function of the brain in relation to behaviors and psychological processes. A neuropsychology may be involved in a condition if a condition involves lesions in the brain and assessments that involve recording electrical activity in the brain. And also, in addition, a neuropsychological evaluation is used to determine whether a person is likely to experience behavioral problems following suspected or diagnosed brain injury, such as stroke. Last is occupational psychology. Occupational or organizational psychologists are involved in assessing and making recommendations about the performance of people at work and in training. They help companies to find more effective ways to function and to understand how people and groups behave at work. And this information can help improve effectiveness, efficiency, job satisfaction, and also employee retention. So, in addition to the branches that I've discussed, there are many other applied branches like military psychology, the legal psychology, the criminal psychology, and also political one. A psychology has broadened its scope today and gaining more and more importance. It may be expected that in days to come, there cannot be any field of life without the application of psychological principles. So, particularly in the field of medicine, for doctors and nurses, the knowledge of psychology is very useful and also essential. The number of branches actually continues to grow as to this time. The the results can enable a doctor to provide treatment that may help the individual achieve possible improvements in cognitive damage that has occurred. Okay, so that's all. Thank you for listening.